Hi, everyone. Richard here at Calvin Wazoo, bringing you a new episode of Frank Zappa, one album at a time. So, I've gone through the first two releases of the Mothers of Invention. We're now coming to the third release, which is actually not a Mother's album, but qualifies as the first solo album that Frank Zappa did. And that one is Lumpy Gravy. So this is a new release by Zappa Records. Okay, so pull it out of its sleeve here. And inside. So this is official number, release number, 3 as it shows here. But as I mentioned, and this of course you don't see Zappa Records release. But as I mentioned, it is a solo album, although a few of the Mothers of Invention do appear on it. I also have, I don't have an original first pressing because the ones that I have seen just weren't worth the money considering the condition they were in. This one, though, that I have is an early British pressing that is on. Of course, you see it has the bizarre stamp, but it was still Verve. And there's a bit of a story behind that. And with the British pressing, it's the black label Verve. So, but I got that one. This began, it was released in May of 1968, and it began actually as a project for Capitol Records. And it was going to be an unofficial orchestra bit that Capitol Records wanted Zappa to do for him. So the whole original concept was strictly going to be orchestral and not have what later, turned out to have with the spoken. There was a reissue, so to speak, semi recently, a mono called Lumpy Gravy Primordial, which, as you see, flips the photos from the original, and the inside of the gatefold is also a little bit different. And this is a Zappa Records recording that actually came out on this very nice translucent burgundy vinyl. And it's a 45 RPM 12-inch. So it comes closer to what Zappa envisioned originally with this release, because he thought that even though he was under contract with MGM Verve, that he could do this side project with Capitol, because he wasn't acting as the Mothers of Invention. He was going to be a composer and conductor, all right? And he was going to have an orchestra. And so he began working with this orchestra and writing the material for it too, sort of on the fly, while he was in motel rooms, and he was in the process of being evicted from his home at the time, because I believe he was based in New York at this time. He might have been in California. But, there was a lot of stuff going on. And he was composing the music and writing it down, so, on the fly, which is not necessarily, an indication of how careless and lackadaisical and laissez-faire about this project, it really is indicative of how brilliant he was as a composer, that he had this vision of music in his head and then was able to write it down into the sheet music, and then he had to send it off to the copyists because they make all the pages for the individual parts. And then he assembled this orchestra, which is called the Abnucios Amuka Electric Symphony Orchestra, which was not an existing orchestra. That was just the name that he gave to the collection of musicians. And there's the credits here, which included a few of the mothers of invention. And the titles of the pieces on this release, on this 12-inch 45, are a bit different than the titles that eventually came out on Lumpy Gravy. For example, side 1, Tableau, is first is Sink Trap, and then Gum Joy, followed by Up and Down, and then closing side 1 is Local Butcher. Then side 2 begins with Gypsy Airs, Hunchy Punchy, goes into Foamy Soaky, Let's Eat Out, and then closes with Teenage Grand Finale. So quite possibly this is the vision that he was working with Capitol. Well, Verve found out about it. And they're saying, no, you're under contract. This is not a legitimate exclusion for you to go off and venture here with Capitol. So there was a lot of fighting going on, and Verve MGM ended up buying what they had taped, and they had already taped most of, I believe, almost the entire orchestral sessions. And so Verve bought it from Capitol for $30,000 and then brought it back to the Verve MGM's Music's recording studios. So as the project came back, to Verve, and it was going to eventually turn into Lumpy Gravy, that's when Zappa added the other material, the spoken word parts, etc. And the interesting thing about the spoken word parts is that he used a technique which he used frequently for subsequent recordings, later on, all the way into Civilization Phase 3. And what that was is he would ask people, and he did this a lot. People would come over to his home, and he would ask them to do this. And he had this grand piano, this Steinway, I believe, and he would ask people to put their head. They would lift, the top and put their head inside, okay, and then they would take a sandbag and lay it against the sustain pedal. So that removed any dampening on any of the key strings. So he would have people talk and converse with each other with their head inside the piano. And because the sandbag was on the sustain pedal, that allowed the strings inside the piano to vibrate along with the sound of their voices. And so he did this not just for Lumpy Gravy, for some sections of Lumpy Gravy. He did this a lot just socially when people would come over. And then he also did it specifically with some other songs in later releases. Some of these other later releases that he recorded this way with the people in their head and the piano showed up on Uncle Meat in the song Electric Aunt Jemima, and also on the Sunpyg. Oh, shut up and play your guitar. In the song Beat It With Your Fist, and also in Leather for the song Leather Goods. And in the release Frank Zappa Meets the Mothers of Prevention, it was used in Porn Wars. And then, of course, I mentioned it was used in Civilization Phase 3. And then it was also used with the song Evelyn, a Modified Dog. I'm not clear, which showed up on One Size Fits All. I'm not real clear, but I think Zappa himself, when he is like singing, Evelyn, a modified dog, viewed the quivering fringe of a special doily, draped across the piano with some surprise. That part he is singing with his head in a piano, so that he gets that little bit of resonance and then a little bit of the vibration from the strings. I haven't found anything that really clearly specifies that, but I have seen references that technique was used in One Size Fits All for that song in particular. Something else Lumpy Gravy can be noted for, and that is for musically many of the themes and melodies that were written for Lumpy Gravy were expanded later into other songs, particularly in the next release by the Mothers of We're Only in It for the Money. So you can hear these melodies and snippets of them in Lumpy Gravy, and then with the next album, We're Only in It for the Money, then you hear these themes expanded more fully into full-fledged songs and often with lyrics brought into them. One of these melodies that is being fairly strongly developed on Lumpy Gravy is Oh No. And this song was something that was in continual development by Frank. It is a unique and interesting song in that parts of it are in 5/4 and other parts are in 7/4. It shows up for the first time, at least with the Mothers, with lyrics on Weasel's Rip My Flesh in 1970. But that was not the first time Oh No was released with lyrics. It just was not released by the Mothers. In 1968, the song was released by a group called the Fraternity of Man, which included a former mother, Elliot Inger. That was the first time Oh No was recorded and released with lyrics. Not precisely the same lyrics as what eventually did come out, though, in 1970 with Weasels. Oh No also became a concert staple and was played many times in live, and it was recorded many times in various albums, such as Ahead of Their Time. You can't do that on stage anymore. The Sampler, #1 release, on Roxy and Elsewhere, on Mitigated Audacity, and Make a Jazz Noise Here, just to name a few live recordings that were released that included a rendition of Oh No. And like I say, there were many other musical themes that were developed and then eventually came out on We're Only in It for the Money, such as Take Your Clothes Off When You Dance is something that first appears in part on Lumpy Gravy. Also very significant with Lumpy Gravy is a 43-second snippet of King Kong, of the key melody of the song King Kong, which eventually became much fully developed on Uncle Meat. In fact, it takes up an entire side of that double album release with the different variations of King Kong. And King Kong is one of, it's probably my favorite single composition by Frank Zappa. And the cool thing about King Kong, it is a very adaptable song. So you have the original way it was released on the Uncle Meat album, which is very similar to that 43-second snippet that's on Lumpy Gravy. But it shows up and was played live in a lot of variations, sometimes with it, well, no saxophone or woodwind instruments at all. It all depended on who he was playing with and what musicians were working with him. Sometimes it would be played in a more of a jazz method, or it could have been reggae or whatever. It was just a very adaptable song, kind of like Peaches and Regalia, that shows up in a lot of different concerts in a lot of different variations. Now, one of the most interesting things, at least to me, with Lumpy Gravy, revolve around the conversations that occur inside the piano. And one of them is on the side two, fairly close to the beginning. And that's when the people with their head inside the piano are talking about the big note. This is a fascinating discussion just on the album itself, but there is a lot more to it. This isn't just random bullshit from stoners, that are doing something for Frank. This concept of the big note, even as the big note is the origin of the universe, has scientific legs to it. So even Frank talks about how everything vibrates. The universe is vibrating. Atoms vibrate. Matter vibrates. Everything in the world is vibrating. And that vibration creates sound. And regardless of whether we can hear it or not, it's still creating sound, because that is the nature of sound. It is vibrations. And so the concept of the universe starting with a big note as opposed to a big bang is not that big of a leap. Just before the release of Lumpy Gravy, in 1967, there was a scientific theory published by a Swiss scientist by the name of Hans Jenny. And he pioneered the field of study called semantics. However, it is semantics spelled with a C, Cymantics. And what Jenny is talking about, and what also Frank talked about, was how sound was the creative force in the universe, and that loose material could be coalesced and begin to form into a single mass simply by providing the right frequency of vibrations or sound to get that coalescing to occur. And I will have a link to some discussion about this in the Down Under. Also, there was in 1965 a couple radio astronomers by the name of Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson. And these two guys stumbled, it was an accident, stumbled upon the discovery of the residual echo of the Big Bang, the Big Bang, the Big Bang, the Big Bang, the Big Bang. All right, and what they discovered was that this residual echo was somewhere between the note B and B flat, roughly 23 octaves higher than middle C. this discovery led to them winning the 1978 Nobel Prize in Physics. So, yeah, you might listen to Lumpy Gravy and think, wow, this is like pretty far out there. But there's a lot going on with this record and a lot of thought. And even with the dialogue passages, some of it is obviously just bizarreness, such as them talking about the ponies and the pigs and ponies, and also the interesting discussion that I think it was Motorhead Sherwood. He's talking about when he was working in a factory and he was making money, and then actually, and when he talks about how much he was earning per hour and he was taking a certain amount home a week, if you actually did the math, you would realize he was working overtime because at 271 an hour, he would not have made that much money in a week. So he must have been working overtime. Anyway, a lot of that was just spontaneous, and some of it was just weird oddness. But the discussion about the big note, that has some gravitas to it. This recording became one of Frank's favorites. He talked about it very fondly, that he really, really enjoyed this, and was very pleased with it. And he identified it as probably his favorite recording. And I admit, too, that this is among my favorites of his. It is a truly incredibly intricate and absorbing album, both musically and both with the dialogue portions. So what do you think of Lumpy Gravy? Do you like it? Because I know it's probably one of those releases in the catalog that people are kind of a little diffident about. But hey, leave your comments in the Down Under. What is your favorite Zappa release? Eventually, I'll probably get to it as I continue this series. Check out the links that I have in the Down Under. Please subscribe to my channel. Thank you for watching this one. And as always, remember, enjoy your music.